I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we haven't podcasted since Thanksgiving break, have we?
Nope, I don't think so.
I mean, the listener, these come out in random order, so the listener is unaware of when we're actually recording this. But I wanted to reveal something that Rob's looking at me kind of funny. I don't think all of our listeners know this. We've said this before, but Rob Moore is not related to Lee Moore. So
very important.
So it was interesting because my folks were over here in Oregon, and Rob's folks live over here in Oregon now, though they're both, all of us are Southerners. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of interesting. I introduced my folks just really quickly to Rob's folks, and it was really funny. I just thought the listener would love to hear the fact that I introduced Mr. and Mrs. Moore to Mr. and Mrs. Moore. The podcast family is now united.
We're a circle, the circle of life,
the circle of Chinese literature podcastia.
It wouldn't make for as catchy a theme song as Elton John wrote, but I think we could probably still get something out of it.
To be fair, who can make as catchy of a theme song as Elton John?
That's a good question.
George
I can
Michael?
Think of at least a dozen people off the top of my head. George Michael. Did he do a theme song?
Freedom!
Is that okay? I didn't realize that was counted as a theme song.
Well, I mean, it's a sort of theme song.
I can think of way catchier theme songs, but that's a
Taylor Swift?
Yeah. No, that's not Taylor Swift. We don't need to talk about Taylor Swift in any fashion.
Don't hate.
Go ahead and sing it, Lee. Just get it out of your system, and then we'll. Don't do it. You're locking and loading, and that's not going to work. We're not going to do that to our poor listeners.
We actually can't do that because that would be violating copyright, which is something
true, because we're so famous now that Taylor Swift is surely aware that we're dropping her name on the podcast.
Taylor Swift, we are coming for you in your numbers.
Next. That's it.
We are going to
dominate.
We're going to dominate 1989, your best album by far.
With our podcast. I don't think that well too. Maybe we'll invite her on sometime.
Yeah, she actually, I think she's a fan. She listens.
I would be, Having now talked about nothing to do with our subject matter for the day, maybe we should segue back into the subject. Or not back into, to the subject matter.
And what's the subject matter, Rob?
Well, we're talking about a classic short story.
Short story?
It's kind of a short story. It's actually a diary. The translation is Miss Sophie's Diary by Dingling.
It's not really all that short, sorry.
It's also, it's not particularly short.
And could you say the name of the author again?
Dingling.
Dingling. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's not her real name.
That's a pen name.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's the name she's definitely most famous.
Yeah, and the Chinese title, Sophie, is not some English version of a Chinese name. The Chinese name is 沙菲女士日记. So Sophie, Miss Sophie 女士 is sort of like a...
Yeah, Miss Sophie.
Miss Sophie, yeah, kind of like that. Diary.
So a really quick rundown on the background information for Miss Sophie's Diary. It's written in 1927 by Dingling. Dingling's heavily influenced by a lot of Western authors. She actually said, I believe, if I had not read a lot of Western literature, I would not be able to write this. So she's drawing off of kind of Flaubert. I've seen this work compared to Madame Bovary, although I don't think that's really...
I'm not sure why. But
yeah, I mean...
It is closer to another author they cite for this one, which is Ibsen. Henry
Ibsen. That's actually what I think of when I think of this. And I believe she was heavily influenced, as everyone who
pretty
was...
much the entire May 4th movement was influenced by Ibsen.
Pretty much the entire 1920s world was influenced by Ibsen, which is funny because he's nowhere now. Like, no one reads Ibsen. He's trash.
Not trash. They still teach him occasionally, but
yeah, whatever.
It does.
It's really bad. I've tried to read it.
It's not bad.
James Joyce taught himself Norwegian, I believe, just so he could read Ibsen in the original. Anyways, Miss Sophia's Diary is written in 1927, so we're talking about almost a decade after the May 4th movement.
Actually, that'll be the New Culture movement kicks off in 1917.
Right. The
May 4th is like 1919, but they're basically the similar era.
To be technical, sometimes the May 4th movement is equated with the New Culture movement.
They're very close, and their goals are very, very similar.
Right. So. The actual May 4th event occurs in 1919. Right. But anyways, the May 4th movement has this kind of hope, promise of like equality and gender equality even, but that all kind of falls apart in this political morass where nothing really happens. Like the KMT actually the KMT, and so that's the party that led Taiwan for a long time now is on the, I'm going to say it, the verge of extinction in Taiwan. But it's a political party that goes back to 1911, 1912 with Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Chinese nation. They are in an alliance with the communists, and they split up. And this split up is very violent. And by violent, I mean lots of communists are killed. Almost a huge number of communists are killed. Dingling is married. Dingling herself is quite a leftist. She's a part of the leftist writers movement. She's married to a guy who ends up getting murdered or executed by the KMT because of his communist leanings. Dingling herself spent several years in jail in the 1930s because of her communist leanings, and then eventually escapes to Yan'an, which is where the communists found their base in the 1930s. This is where Mao was. He led the Long March to Yan'an. This is where he essentially successfully launched the takeover of all of China. So Dingling eventually becomes a part of the kind of communist apparatus. In 1957, she's labeled a rightist, and she is persecuted. She's forced to do manual labor, clean up pig crap, just like Deng Xiaoping, I believe. And she is, in 1978, recuperated. Her reputation is recuperated, and she dies in 1986 in Beijing. But she actually spent several years, I think, at the University of Iowa's writers program. She's an interesting person. She, in some ways, represents this left-leaning writer group, but she also has some real problems with it because those left-leaning writers are often just as misogynistic as the conservatives who she really hated. And I'd say first and foremost, she's a feminist writer. And that's what she's most famous for in Miss Sophie's Diary. It's a feminist kind of anthem, I would say.
One of the things that makes it that is the narrator's basically power to decide everything that happens in the story for herself. We're not presented with any firm perspectives on just about anything. She changes her mind frequently, but in service to nothing but herself. It is not. She does not change her mind about a man that she's next to because the party apparatus or the government or
because other men
anything.
Decided.
It's her and her alone. She decides, and it's a fascinating story because when you start talking to people about it, you'll run into things like Lee and I, just before this started, I said to Lee, I said, this one of the interesting things in the story is the bisexuality. And he was like, what are you talking about? But depending on how you read it, it is quite easy to see that running all the way through. But the reason that we have a disagreement like that is because the way it's written is so subtle and so kind of not vague, but
it's interiorized to the point where there is no external world. She's referencing her external world, but we're entirely inside of her mind space.
And one of the things that's interesting is it is the second major diary form story that we have in this movie. The other one, of course, is Diary of a Madman,
which we've done a podcast on.
Right. In some ways, this one is more interesting because it functions as a diary in the truest sense of the word. She's only writing stuff down that someone who's writing a diary would write. There's no sort of narrative mic drops where she's like, oh, and by the way, I also like women and men together. There's nothing that why would a person write this in a diary? I don't know.
We were trying to discuss whether normally we give summaries of works when we talk about them, and we were discussing that with this story. It's impossible to give a summary of what happens, right? Like, I mean, you have her, she is dealing with kind of issues of working, school, the kind of real world issues. She has two men in her life. And there's some very tense sexual moments. One man is he's Singaporean Chinese, so he represents this kind of non-Chinese thing. And then one guy is think all American but all Chinese.
Yeah.
And he's like the Chinese guy.
The all American boy. Yeah.
Exactly. He's less sophisticated than the Singaporean, has less money. We don't really want to get into the kind of dynamics of, if you could call it a plot, we don't want to get into the dynamics of plot because we don't want to ruin anything for the listener. But it's just so hard to kind of grasp. There's no stability in the narrative. Like you're just struggling with, what the heck is she talking about?
Right, and I think that gets back to why I think this is a better done diary than Lu Xun's, in the sense that you really can't summarize it.
Yeah.
Everything that happens in this piece is just connections between people, how they work.
Lu Xun's diary story is a story.
Yes.
This is not a story.
It's not. But this is also why I think it's a more accomplished piece, because it's taking the genre, if you want to call it that, of sort of diary writing, and really running with it, playing with it. I mean, there are comments in there, lots of phrases. I was even thinking about a passage to read, and it's very hard to locate one.
Yeah.
Because
it's very hard to locate any passage.
Because there's lots of sections where she'll write something, and you think, wait, so...
How does that have to do with anything?
That, or does it mean that she's thinking this? Like, is she going to, what? But that's what you would write in a diary. You wouldn't explain yourself at length if it's you, right?
So
Who would you need to explain it to?
Let me ask you, why is she writing in diary form?
I mean, I'm sure there's lots of reasons. One that I would just toss out there is this is, is often studied as one of the best examples of writings by Chinese women in the early 20th century, and I think
it's one of the most famous works of a Chinese female writer in the early 20th century. If you're going to do a class on Chinese feminism, this is going to be in it.
And to some extent, the diary format could be appealing to someone writing, frankly, in the middle of a boys' club. I mean, which the May 4th movement certainly was in a lot of ways.
So she's writing this in 1927. She gets married to a leftist writer in 1925, and she's transitioning from this period where she is in Shanghai in a girls' school, I believe. She's studying all these Western writers. She's heavily influenced by the West. And then when she gets married, she's transitioning into this heavily male May 4th world that's dominated by the men of May 4th. Lu Xun being the best
example. Calendar suggests the men of May 4th.
That's actually how we're raising money for the podcast.
We're only going to sell like 3 copies.
We should totally do that.
Yeah, we should maybe not. Anyway, continue.
But you've got the men of May 4th, and it's a boys' world out there.
And this is not to say that there were no women writing this, but it's that the people dominating the discussion, and I mean say dominating in the truest sense of the word, controlling the publishing apparatus, influencing university administrations, et cetera, are the men, or Hu Shi, Lu Xun, Zhou Zoren, people like that. So with that being the case, the power differential is such that a woman like Ding Ling is not simply going to kick the door down, grab the publishing apparatus, and start her own thing. That's an option, of course, but
she did. When she published this was a phenomenally successful book.
But what I was going to say, if you were in her shoes, choosing a specific genre to work in, the diary form makes a lot of sense because it is a way to describe the real interiority of a female character, which had not really been done before.
No, not in a kind of modern sense.
In a raw, real sense.
Yeah.
But using a diary, because it's supposed to be private, that's a kind of conceit of the genre. Well, this is, I'm not of my own sort of espousing this position. This is a person's interior personal thoughts. This is not a sort of broader commentary necessarily on what's happening.
Do you think the fact that it's a diary associates it more with women? I mean, certainly men kept diaries, but the sort of interiority of the home, which this is kind of dealing with, is very associated with women in Chinese culture, right?
Yeah, and I guess it makes sense in a very masculine and male-dominated world to have this genre. I mean, as you mentioned, there were men keeping diaries as well, but
Lu Xun kept his diary in classical Chinese.
Right. Lu Xun's diary is incredibly boring as well.
But it starts out just like this diary, which is noting what the weather is like.
Yeah, not bad.
So let's jump to that first section.
Right.
One of the things that I thought that was so interesting about this first section is how closed off this world is. We've been using big, highfalutin literary words like interiority, but when you start reading that first section, it just feels kind of like you've got literary cabin fever.
Yeah.
She's stuck in her house. She can't go out because there's a typhoon. It's raining. She just wants something to read. She can't go to sleep at night. It's almost kind of like there's something mental going on. And I believe Dingling, according to Tanny Barlow, who is an expert on Dingling, she suggested that she was going through depression at this time, if I remember correctly. And it feels like this kind of closed off, depressed world where she's just struggling for anything to do. And she asked, like, how can people just sit around at night with nothing to do and not reading anything? There's also this kind of like voracious appetite for books or magazines or newspapers, which is in and of itself a very modern conceit, because newspapers are something that to a certain degree comes from the West. They had early newspapers in the Qing dynasty that have little to do with the West, but the newspaper as an institution is closely associated with the West. And there's just this kind of like, she wants, it's almost like a hunger for reading and a hunger. And then, so this short story, long story, novella, I don't know what you want to call it, starts out, and we're just completely inside her head and nothing is happening. That first diary entry, absolutely nothing happens plot-wise. She has trouble going to... I mean, it feels almost like Proust in that she's having trouble going to sleep. She's wanting to read, and she's just not going anywhere.
Which is a diary.
That's true.
I mean, this is why I keep coming back to this point. But with Lu Xun's There's a Diary of a Madman, there's a kind of a clear narrative at work.
Yeah,
it's very linear,
not
right?
a diary. Yeah.
It's not really a diary. It's a short story that's broken up in diary form. This one... Here's first couple of sentences just so you can understand what Lee and I are talking about. It says, 24th of December. It's blowing again today. The wind woke me up before daybreak. Then the attendant came in to light the stove. I knew that I'd never get back to sleep again and that my head would start spinning if I didn't get up. If I lay there wrapped up in my quilt, I brooded too much on all those weird notions. The doctor says it would be better if I had plenty of sleep and plenty of food, didn't read, and didn't think. But that's impossible.
Yeah. It's just...
And here's the other thing. Attendant, doctor. Now, if this was a story, you'd have something letting us know this person's in a hospital for this thing.
Yeah.
And she mentions the fact throughout that she has tuberculosis, at least in various places. But there's no obvious grounding the reader gesture where she writes something like, gee, I've had tuberculosis
and
now
I'm
for
in
5
a sanatorium.
years. Yeah, no. She just writes. She writes about drinking milk and reading the newspaper.
Yeah, that was kind of weird, actually. And that's this kind of like gesturing towards the West.
Yeah, it's a lot of just peculiar things like that. But again, it's a very successful gesture towards the genre because this is what you put in a diary.
Yeah.
It's stuff you already know.
Particularly if you are crazy.
Especially if you are struggling and aren't sure what to do, and writing is what keeps you from going insane.
Do you think it's writing or reading that keeps her from going insane?
Because why write a diary like this?
They're very different acts.
But they're connected. At least in this diary, they're connected.
Sure.
I mean, because why keep a diary? You either keep a diary to sort of express your own thoughts and give yourself a place to sort of vent and explore, or you use it for some official reason, right?
Do you feel like she's exploring her interiority she's exploring her selfness, or do you feel like she's kind of like putting her selfness out there for others to consume?
I think this is how I read it. That this is not the exploration of one's interior self. This is being so much in one's interior self that writing is a way to get out, because this is putting on the page what she has already too much of, because she's cooped up so often with tuberculosis and sanatoriums and things like that.
I just want to point something out here. So a cool little statistic that I noted when reading this. So the word 我, which is just I in Chinese, it's the first person pronoun of Chinese, occurs 1,138 times in the story.
Wow.
And the story is only about 1,300 lines.
Wow. That's crazy.
So almost one I for every line of text in my count.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of it's so self-obsessed.
It is, but again, diary. I mean, if you're not lost, if you are, well, maybe lost in your own self and you're unsure what to do about that, this often meandering style would be fairly natural, right? I mean, and it would be why you write it in the first place. You wouldn't write it because I have something important to say I want everyone to know. You write it because I got to do something, so I'm going to do this. There's no unifying thread. There's no search for a thing. It's just writing, just pure writing, almost stream of consciousness.
I want to point out two things that are very radical about this text. So the first is that it's moving from this very interior space, which is totally a creation. Like, there was no psychology in pre-May 4th writing. That we don't really see any kind of psychology, like
conscious psychology.
Yeah. So we don't get inside characters' heads. In other words, like I'm thinking of the Jinping Mei, which is probably the most psychological novel of pre-May 4th writing. And even there, we don't ever get into their heads.
Right.
We just get to see kind of something about their motives, and there are questions as to whether or not they're even real characters. Sophie is a real character.
Yes.
She is there. She is an individual who is I. She's totally different from anybody else. And that is, I think, the kind of radical, the most radical thing about this this novella. The second is that she's moving from, there's this movement where she moves from that very first position where it's the wind blowing, there's a typhoon coming through, and you feel that, what I called literary cabin fever. She moves out of that. It's not all about that. But I think that movement, in a sort of way, tracks the movement that Dingling wants to project onto women. That there's this move from the inside, from being interior, from women being concerned with stuff about the house, to a more external, like, thing, to being concerned about world affairs and love, and that's okay because
love and sex as well.
Love and sex. It's an incredibly sexy novella.
It's very sexual.
I mean, for 1920s China, wow.
Well, and it's funny because there are several suggestions. I do read them as suggestions of bisexuality here as well, which to some extent I think is gestured at in other places in Chinese tradition, but very, very, very subtly.
Sometimes less so.
There's a section, for example, where two of the character Sophie's friends, she invites him to the cinema, and they invite along a girl named Jianru. And Sophie says this about her, about Jianru. In her looks and movements, she's just like a friend I had when I was young. So I often found myself chasing her before I realized what I was doing. And she deliberately gave me a lot of the courage I needed to get close to her. Now, it's possible to read that as just someone encouraging her to be her friend. But it's also very easy to read that as, why would you chase someone you want to be your friend? And then you have sort of obsessive behavior. She says, once I sent her 8 long letters in a single week, but she ignored them completely.
Yeah, there's a sense of jealousy.
Okay, but this is why it's interesting, though, because these are themes that, none of these themes are non-existent in all of Chinese tradition. Yep. But like you said, they are kept inside a certain place.
So I want to disagree with you.
Okay.
I think that they're very present in... So Jinping Mei has them, Hong Lu Meng has them. So Hong Lu Meng is just Dream of the Red Chamber. They have... I mean, Hong Lu Meng is all about a guy and his love of a couple of different women, but there is some, young boy in school sex chapters.
Okay,
What's interesting about this is that it's a woman who is authorized to have bisexual feelings.
I think that's where I was going.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's a good clarification. These themes
I'm
do
glad
exist.
you agree that I'm right.
For once. This is the first time in the history of the podcast that Lee has been right. No.
Red letter day.
That's it. It's almost the end of the year, so I got to give you one anyway. It's a good point because there are quite a few stories where homosexuality between men is easy to spot.
We've discussed them on the podcast.
There's a couple there's quite a few of these passages.
This is very much a gay-friendly podcast.
Yeah. But it's interesting because
Rob laughs uncomfortably.
I'm always just thinking about people who are dialing out of the podcast now because we're using the wrong term, or I don't know. You never know. But anyway, but my point simply was that with this short story, this is one of the first times where you have a female writer putting it out there on the page for the same kind of thing happening between women.
And it's not just female sexuality that she's putting out on there on the page, or female bisexuality, or insinuations of female bisexuality, however you want to put it. But feminine sexuality being put out here for the very first time is another way of just saying feminine individuality.
Right.
Women weren't really characters in Chinese literature before Miss Sophie. They were very flat, two-dimensional characters.
They were sort of plot devices almost. They certainly are in a lot of mainstream
I mean,
fiction.
the most interesting female character that I can think of in pre-May 4th literature is, of course, Pan Jinlian from Jinping Mei, who is still kind of flat.
And in referencing the Jinping Mei, that's an interesting reference, because the other thing about the sexuality in this piece by Dingling is that the sexuality put forth is physical, carnal. It's not, she falls in love, or says she does, who knows really, in a diary, with a man because of his looks, his body.
She's obsessing over his lips at certain points. It's really very sexual and physical kind of sexuality.
In the tradition, that's not what women are supposed. They're supposed to be after sort of stability and family and home and tradition.
They're about making babies.
Yeah.
In Chinese literature.
Yes. Thanks. It's a very important clarification. And here, definitely not. Not only is she not interested in home, family, traditional mores.
She's moving out of the house.
She's not even interested in just one man. She's interested in more than one, and possibly more than one woman as well.
Which is totally a violation of traditional Chinese norms.
Right. And again, it's the sort of thing that you would expect to see in a diary. Like it's almost like Dingling's stories. Okay, look, have you ever wondered what the female characters in all these stories you've read were really thinking? This is what they were thinking, right? It's not that all of a sudden you have a brand new figure and it is called modern woman. This person has always existed.
So I just want to clarify something really quickly about feminine sexuality in Chinese culture. So in Chinese culture, the traditional family was one man, and his wife, but you could always add more women.
Concubines,
yeah. Mm-hmm. There was always the main wife and the husband, but other women could be added. They were considered sisters. Mm-hmm. And they could make up a family. There's this weird kind of like Confucian family web of relationships. Right. But what was never orthodox is one wife, multiple men. And although that did happen, Matthew Summers, who is an incredible historian, has done some work on this. It was never orthodox. Like people, we know that people did it, but no one ever acknowledged. No one ever really like fessed up to it unless they had to in court.
And it wouldn't have been the mainstream.
No,
which is why this story is so fascinating. One of the reasons the story is so fascinating, because this story is hugely successful when it comes out.
It's almost scandalous, right?
Yeah, or would have been then. Now,
no, it was. It was scandalous when it came out.
Yeah. Now, I don't think it would be read that way anymore, but it is still striking because you feel like you really are reading someone's deeply personal experiences.
There's an image, when I was doing some research before we started the podcast, there's an image of Dingling from the 1930s where she is just facing you and staring straight into you, and it feels like she's boring into you, like with her eyes.
Yeah.
And I feel a little bit like I feel like she is allowing us to do the same thing to her, to all of Chinese womandom in this story. That's one of the things that makes this story so incredible. It's like you get to kind of like jump into the space that women have in the 1920s. It's almost kind of voyeuristic.
It's almost voyeuristic. It's almost uncomfortable. There are places where it's almost uncomfortable, not because of the subject matter, but because of the way it's related.
Because of how closely we were able to see
feel like you're
hairs on the
peeking over
people's
someone's shoulder as they're writing their personal thoughts. You feel like you should close the book and maybe not read it anymore. Which, for me, is the ultimate recommendation of something like this. It's written so well.
Can I say this?
Yeah.
It's mildly titillating.
Yeah, I was waiting for some kind of pun like that to come around. That's well done. So that
wasn't really a pun.
No, it's not a pun. That's true. It's not a pun. But it's the sort of word that you would expect to hear if someone was making a joke.
From Lee's mouth.
From Lee's mouth. I wasn't going to say it, but you did. So.
From Lee's dirty
mouth.
It's amazing we've been able to keep the podcast so clean for so long.
So PG-13 in places.
But now I think we should make the podcast more titillating.
I'm not going to say anything after that. You've already got my recommendations for the story. So
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.